pending which I yield the balance of my time to which I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purpose of debate only. Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of the rule and the 2 underlying bills. House Resolution 243 provides for an open rule for consideration of H.R. 2216, the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs and Related Agencies Appropriation Act of 2014, and H.R. 2217, the Department of Homeland Security Appropriation Act of 2014. This rule provides ample opportunities for members from both minority and majority to participate in the debate, and it does not limit the number of amendments by which that may be considered, so long as the amendments comply with the rules of the House. My colleagues from both sides of the aisle agree that these appropriation acts for fiscal year 2014 are the products of an open, collaborative, and bipartisan process. They provide critical funding for military construction, housing, schools, and medical facilities for our service members and their families, important veterans programs, the protection of and security of our airports, seaports, and national border, and disaster relief efforts. They also reduce duplication, improve oversight, encourage efficiency, and increase coordination of services. Mr. Speaker, these bills address nonpartisan issues that affect every one of us. The seamless operation of these agencies and programs and projects will benefit all Americans. Let me first address H.R. 2216, the Military Construction, Veterans Affairs and Related Agencies Appropriation Act of 2014. This fiscally sound bill funds programs that are necessary to keep our promises to our veterans and to train, equip, house, and support the brave men and women in uniform as well as their families. This bill provides over $73 billion in discretionary funds, which is $1.4 billion above the enacted fiscal year 2013 level. It continues to provide advanced funding that was approved in fiscal year 2013 for veterans and medical care. The funds programs reduce the staggering backlog which severely delayed the process of veterans benefits claims. This advanced funding will ensure that our veterans have full medical access to medical care regardless of where we stand in the annual appropriation process. H.R. 2216 funds military construction projects including family housing, military medical facilities, and Department of Defense educational facilities. It also funds critical VA medical services and provides for a unified electronic health record system to integrate Department of Defense and Veterans Affairs health records. Currently, our veterans must physically present a hard copy of their DoD health records at their VA appointments, and physicians are unable to look up the patient's medical history if a patient does not have their records with them. This bill addresses this frustrating and inefficient process and will begin to replace an archaic paper record system with an electronic system that will ensure our veterans will be efficiently served and receive the care they need and deserve. Next, I'd like to talk about and highlight a few of the important provisions in H.R. 2217. The Department of Homeland Security and Appropriation Act of 2014. This bill is essential to protect the security of our national borders and the safety and well-being of all Americans. This bill provides $28 billion in discretionary funding for the Department of Homeland Security, which includes funding for 21,370 Border Patrol agents and nearly 22,800 Customs and Border Protection officers, the largest totals in history. It also directs U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement to train agents to identify and assist victims of human trafficking, and directs ICE to increase spending on human trafficking and smuggling investigations. H.R. 2217 also provides funding for FEMA to ensure our nation is prepared to provide disaster relief and funds the Coast Guard. Finally, I'd like to reiterate that these bills strengthen our national security and continue the well-being of our brave service members their families, and our veterans. They also recognize that our growing debt threatens the stability and safety of our nation, and for this reason, these bills make recommendations to reduce bureaucratic inefficiencies, duplication, and overhead. Once again, Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this rule and the underlying legislation. The Appropriation Committee has worked hard to provide us with two fiscally responsible appropriation bills that will meet the housing, construction, medical needs of our military and provide support to their families. They will keep our promises to the American veterans, and they will enhance our national security. I encourage my colleagues to vote yes on the rule and yes on the underlying bill, and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time is reserved. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much. I'd also like to thank my friend and colleague, the gentleman from Florida, the former Speaker of the Florida House of Representatives, who clearly championed there and here does likewise regular order. Mr. Speaker, this rule provides for consideration of H.R. 2216 and H.R. 2217 as outlined by my colleague from the other side. Two appropriations measures that fund military construction and family housing projects, the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Homeland Security. Once again, my friends on the other side are using this as yet another attempt, this particular rule, to deem and pass the controversial budget offered by our colleague Paul Ryan. This is exactly what they did in April of last year when they reneged on their promises in the Budget Control Act, and also during consideration of H.R. 5326, the Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations for fiscal year 2013. My Republican colleagues have been calling for regular order. However, both the House and the Senate each passed a budget this year, and regular order would have them go to conference to negotiate a budget for the 113th Congress. But instead of appointing conferees, the Speaker of the House and the House Republican leadership is deeming the Ryan budget passed. Someone in a graphic that I saw said they're deeming the impossible deem. I, as one exemplar, should know, having served on the Rules Committee and the majority when we were going forward, we did consider deem and pass, and we learned along the way that that was going to skew the process, and therefore we retreated from that, and I would urge my friends, the Republicans, to do likewise. They would rather see, it appears, greater military spending at the expense of vital programs that millions of Americans rely on than work with Democrats to replace the sequester and properly fund our nation's government. Now, I'm not going through the litany of all the things that the sequester has cut and the problems that it has caused. Most people know that. But the Meals on Wheels program has been the one put forward. And I just think it's plain dumb and crazy to not take care of older people in our society. Never mind all the ideology, all the deficit, all the other hawk talk. Who cares when someone that is a grandmother goes to sleep hungry because we didn't do what we should have done, and that we passed a foolish sequester that has caused these problems. As a result, we're working with different budget target levels. In the House is $0.966 trillion and approximately $1.7 trillion for the Senate, which both sides agreed upon in the Budget Control Act of 2011. These differences are important. The reductions imposed by the House 302B allocations mean greater cuts for agencies and programs that already face difficult budget decisions due to sequestration. The two funding bills coming before us for consideration this week, along with those for defense and the legislative branch, are the only ones expected to receive an increase over the 2013 post-sequester levels. This means that we'll be forced to sacrifice health care, environment, education, transportation, and other important spending priorities in order to meet the new overall reductions required by the sequester. Furthermore, the appropriation for military construction and Veterans Affairs is the only budget with a 302 allocation that is higher than pre-sequestration funding levels, whereas funding for Homeland Security, in my opinion, is unacceptably low in some areas, and the bill is encumbered by very, very troublesome riders, and I would urge the members of the House to look very carefully at those riders. Consequently, the 302B allocation would provide a 22% reduction to the pre-sequestration budget for health care, education, and labor programs. In my opinion, that's just plain outrageous. Republicans are again asking, I'm fond of saying in the Rules Committee that when I was 11 and 12 years old, my favorite radio program that my grandmother would let me listen to on Saturdays was a program called Let's Pretend. And little did I know, 65 years later, that I would be in an august body that is awesome in and of itself, sitting around with people pretending that things are happening that are not happening. What you're asking us to pretend is that the Ryan budget is law, when in fact it is not. This unilateral action is a formula for conflict, and I predict for you that that's what we will have. While I appreciate the spirit of bipartisanship, and those gentlemen that came there yesterday, Mr. Price and Mr. Bishop, the ranking members, and Judge Carter, and the counterpart to him, did an exceptional job, John Culberson, in showing this body that there can be bipartisan efforts, and they did so, and I would hope that that would serve for the rest of the appropriations and for this body to take notice that people can work together when they try. And that bipartisanship led to the funding levels contained within both these bills that we are considering under this rule. It is regrettable that it was not extended to the entire process. Simply put, the framework within which we are considering these bills, the Ryan budget that House Republicans have deemed as passed, is a non-starter. The administration's folks said yesterday, and I quote them, "Unless this bill passes the Congress in the context of an overall budget framework that supports our recovery and enables sufficient investments in education, infrastructure," footnote right there, do we need to be reminded about the bridge that fell in the state of Washington, about the number of bridges in this nation that are in disrepair and have been in disrepair? When Bill Clinton became the president, he advocated that there were 14,000 bridges in need of repair, and he asked for a little bit of money that we should have allocated then. Now we have thousands of bridges in disrepair, and we are going about a process like this ignoring them. Where do we get the innovation at NIH for the health needs that are coming and the technological needs that are coming? And how do we protect national security for our economy to be able to compete in the future? The President's senior advisors indicated that they would recommend to the President that he veto 2216 and 2217 and any other legislation that implements the House deemed budget framework. As I've said time and again, this is no way to run a budget process and no way to conduct the business of the House of Representatives. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
This time is reserved. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just want to remind everyone that we're talking about a rule here. And this rule, different from those that were proposed in the Congresses before I got here, in the 111th Congress, is an open rule. It allows for amendments. If there are those who do not like what's in these bills, they can do everything they need to do in an amendment and get 218 votes and pass it, and it'll change. If this bill needs perfecting, either one of these bills need perfecting, they can be perfected. I believe that is as close to regular order as we can get. If we can come down to this floor, offer an amendment, get an opportunity to debate that amendment, have our say, hopefully get the votes to pass it, change the bill, that's the way this process should work. This rule provides for that. It provides for two very well thought out appropriation bills which may have flaws. But if there are flaws, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, come on down. Once we pass this rule, we'll be taking those bills up one at a time. And they can offer any amendment that needs to be offered, as long as it's within the germanity rules of this House, can be offered. And we would welcome that, and I think both sides would welcome that. That's why when both of these bills came out of committee, there were glowing reports both from the minority report and from the majority report. They are well thought out bills. They are well done bills. They are bipartisan. They're done in the open, in a collaborative way, in an open, real, and regular order process. So for that, I think this is a great rule because it sets forward the opportunity of people on this floor, no matter who they are, from freshman to senior member, from Republican to Democrat, from moderate, liberal, and conservative, no matter who they are, can offer amendments to this bill, these bills, both of them. And if they get a majority vote, they can pass them. So I think that, to me, is an open process. That's also regular order. I yield back and reserve the rest of my time.
This gentleman reserves his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, my colleague began by saying that's as close to regular order as we can get. I would tell him close, but no cigar. Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield to my very good friend from New York, 2.5 minutes, the gentlewoman, Ms. Loy, who has been on the Appropriations Committee at times when we didn't deem things and that we did, in fact, pass appropriations measures.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for 2.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong opposition to this rule, which would deem the discretionary spending levels in the Ryan budget as law. The Ryan budget endorses sequestration, is unrealistic, unworkable, economically misguided. The Senate and the White House are using a different set of numbers. By adopting the rule and the Ryan budget and breaking caps in the Budget Control Act, which passed this body, we guarantee gridlock. The House majority will pass a small number of bills at roughly the President's requested levels, but will be unable to get bipartisan support for the remaining bills. It would also jeopardize our economic recovery. Europeans are experiencing the limits of austerity in the midst of a fragile recovery. We should invest more in education, biomedical research, transportation infrastructure, clean energy, and other initiatives that grow our economy and create jobs. Instead, the deeming resolution would take a step back, all but ensuring significant reductions. To turn off the sequester, ensure the House's relevance in the process, and pass reasonable bills, Democrats offered in a committee a motion to postpone consideration of subcommittee allocations until a budget resolution could be conferenced. And I do want to say this, and I would like to say this to my friend, the distinguished chair on the other side of the House, there has been a call for a budget resolution on the Senate. They did a budget resolution on the Senate that has been requested by my good friends on the other side of the aisle. That budget resolution passed. However, I know the chairman of the House Budget Committee, ranking member of the House Budget Committee, Chris Van Hollen, has called for a conference, went to the Rules Committee 5 times and said, let's have a conference so we can move forward. That was denied.
An additional 1 minute.
Gentlelady from New York is recognized for an additional 1 minute.
So, my colleagues, with a balanced deficit reduction plan, we could establish an alternative allocation that would sufficiently fund our priorities and allow us to follow regular order for the appropriations process. Instead of my friends engaging today in a futile process, it's just a futile exercise. The House should abide by the discretionary caps in the Budget Control Act, turn off the sequester before we consider spending bills. My friends, vote no on the rule.
Ms. Lloyd, just before you leave, you had just an additional few minutes, seconds. Would you yield to me?
I'd be delighted to.
All right. I just want to say, in addition to the fact that Chris Van Hollen came to the Rules Committee 5 times, Harry Reid has offered 8 times to go to conference, and Republicans have blocked it. And I just want that to be understood, because later on we're going to hear somebody stand up here and say it's Democrats that are holding it up, and it's not. I thank the gentlelady for yielding.
And if the gentleman would yield back to me, I
yield the gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
I just want to make
recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
I just want to make a point to my friend on the other side of the aisle. The bill before us today is a bipartisan bill. There was strong support on both sides of the aisle. The chair and the ranking member worked together in a collegial way because this bill is so important for our country. The problem here is after this bill and Homeland Security, there's nothing left. Education, National Institutes of Health, in a bill that's going to be cut 22%. So, my friend, the issue is not these bills today, it's the process and the fact there isn't a complete plan in place. Thank you.
Time has expired. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been in this process a long time, not necessarily here, but in other venues, and what I've found is what's before you is before you, and what comes later may or may not come later. But I would say this to the lady that what we have here are 2 bills that are bipartisan bills, and they have a great deal of input from both sides. They came out of committee with a strong vote with both Republicans and Democrats. And so in my thought is, here we are. We're here. We're addressing this particular issue. Now, when these other bills come to the floor of the House, before they get here, they're going to pass through the Rules Committee too, these appropriation bills. I will do everything I can to make them open also, so that anybody that wants to amend them or perfect them has the opportunity. I believe in an open process. I believe that members, no matter how long it takes, should have the opportunity to say their piece. And no matter what your philosophy is, no matter what your party is, no matter what your position is, no matter what your rank is, if you're 435th, it doesn't really matter. You should have an opportunity to present your case. And so these 2 bills. We have talked about the fact that we're going to have an open process here, and people want to perfect these bills, then great, offer an amendment. When the other appropriation bills come, that'll be the time to talk about them. But when they do, just know this, I'm going to be one that is going to be pressing hard to have open rules for them also. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time
Will the gentleman yield for a moment?
Well,
gentleman has reserved his time. Gentleman from Florida.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Maryland, my very good friend, Mr. Hoyer, the minority whip of the House of Representatives.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my friend, the Speaker, Acting Speaker. What's before us is before us. What's before us is a rule. not the Milcon bill, not Homeland Security. What's before us is the bill. And what does the bill do? It doesn't have an open process. It doesn't allow us an amendment. Mr. Van Hollen wanted to have an amendment and say, let's go to conference on the budget. Let's decide what these numbers ought to be. No, it's our way or the highway. You've passed a budget. You're going to stick with those numbers. They won't work. You know they won't work. That's why you don't go to conference. Because Mr. Ryan knows he couldn't make a deal that he could bring back to this House and your side would vote for. I tell my friend on the Rules Committee. So what's before us is before us. A ratification of sequester, which starts with S, which stands for stupid. It is a terrible process. It is an irrational, common sense defying process. And yet my Republican friends continue to demand that we mark to figures that were contrary to the understanding, agreement, deal, if you want, that we made. In August of 2011, we made a deal. And we said, these are going to be the numbers. And the ink was not dry on the paper until such time as you violated that agreement. And the Ryan budget violates it once again and is $91 billion, almost 9%, less than the deal we made. What's before us is before us, the gentleman says. What's before us is the rule to ratify the sequester. Now, your side blames the President for it. The President doesn't want the sequester. We don't want the sequester. Mr. Van Hollen, who's sitting here, doesn't want the sequester, and he's tried to offer amendments to obviate the sequester and hasn't been allowed to have those amendments on the floor, I tell my friend on the Rules Committee. And I congratulate him for his position. But he ought to allow the Van Hollen amendment so the House can, in fact, work it. I thank
A minute.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker. So that the House can work its will. So that we can, in fact, have a process that will work. Now, my friend says he's been here for some time and he's participated in another legislative body. Well, I've been here for a long time myself, as the gentleman knows. Some 33 years and 12 years in the Maryland Senate, President of the Senate for the last 4 I was there. So I've been around for some years myself. The fact is, I will tell the gentleman, there is no possibility you're going to consider all 12 bills. Because as the gentlelady said, you're going to run out of money. Why? Because you're front-loading that which you like, and that which you're not too happy about is going to be not only breaking the agreement we made, but far below your own budget numbers. Because you didn't want to mark to your 966 with this bill. Why? Because you wanted to make sure the veterans were taken care of. God bless you. I agree with that. But there's only X number of dollars in that pot. And somebody's going to lose. What the President is saying is, let's consider them all together. That's what we ought to be doing. Reject this rule, reject this sequester, reject this deeming resolution, and let us have a rule that makes common sense for our country. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I will reiterate the fact that it is what is before us. We cannot get to these two bipartisan, well thought out, well debated, well collaborated pieces of legislation which deal with some issues that are very, very important. We cannot get to them without passing a rule to allow us to do that. That's what this rule does. It deals with those two bills. No, those two bills aren't before us, but this rule is the gateway to get to those bills. How are we going to get there? We're going to pass this rule. Once we get there, what are we going to do? We're going to have an open process, one that has been foreign until the Republicans took control of this legislature. Foreign. No matter what your standing in this body was, there were closed bill after closed bill after closed bill after closed bill that came up. Was there an opportunity to amend it, to perfect it, to do anything with it? Absolutely not. But that's not the way it is now. If we pass this rule, we're going to get to a process that allows every member to come down to this floor, offer an amendment, debate that amendment, and have the possibility of passing that amendment. So, yes, There are other issues, there are other appropriations, there are other bills that will be coming to this floor at some point in time. And at that time, we can debate them. But right now, this is the issue before us. These two bills, very important bills, and very much agreed on bills, are only going to be taken up on this floor if this rule passes. So I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserved. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would you please advise both sides the amount of time remaining?
Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, has 13½ minutes remaining. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster, has 19 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased and privileged at this time to yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, my friend, Ms. DeLauro.
Gentlelady from Connecticut is recognized for 3 minutes.
I rise in strong opposition to this rule, which aims to approve the House majority's inadequate appropriations allocation level for 2014, a level that is over $90 billion below that of the Senate and the President. And it violates the agreement that we all voted on a year ago, Democrats and Republicans, in the Budget Control Act to increase that funding above the number that they present to us today. The budget reflects our values, reflects our priorities, and our responsibilities to the people that we represent. It is our job to make sure that that is the case. And yet, for the third time in 3 years, this House majority has put forward a reckless and ideological funding level that ensures that our government cannot even meet its most basic responsibilities to the American people. And under this House majority's plan, we will see cuts that are deeper than the indiscriminate across-the-board cuts. The funding for the Labor, Education, Health and Human Services Committee is drastically cut, and this rule accepts those cuts made to the program this year, and then it multiplies that by 4 in 2014. What are those cuts? Where do they fall? And if enacted, the wrong choices will cause incalculable damage. They severely weaken these critical programs that protect public health and safety, that promote and develop our workforce, training programs, education, Pell Grants, Meals on Wheels, special education, biomedical research so that people can live, It affects our seniors, our veterans, our middle class, and our most vulnerable families. I, along with Congressman Van Hollen and others, have offered legislation that cuts $30 billion from the federal deficit, replaces the deep and indiscriminate cuts for the next 2 years with a more balanced and a targeted approach. That's the direction we should be moving in, keeping up with our fundamental responsibilities to the families who have elected us to stand up for them. Rather than going down this path, the House majority should appoint budget conferees, do its job, negotiate with the Senate. You know, our Appropriations Chairman claims to want to undo sequestration, yet rather than showing leadership, the House majority fails to address the sequester and creates conditions for another budget crisis down the road. We hear so much talk from this majority about regular order. What does that mean? House passes a bill, Senate passes a bill, they work out their differences, they get it to the President, and the President signs the bill. Well, Mr. Speaker, where is the regular order?
I yield the gentlelady an additional 30 seconds.
Gentlelady from Connecticut is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
There's no regular order here. It is about autocracy. That's what we're dealing with. No more games. I urge all of my colleagues, vote against this disastrous funding level. Let's work. Let's work together to fix the sequester, get us back on the path to economic growth. This is our top priority. It must be our top priority, and this House of Representatives needs to show the American people that it can lead. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to reiterate again the benefits of these two bills that we're going to be debating if we pass this rule. They provide critical funding for military construction, housing, schools, and medical facilities for our service members and their families, important veterans programs. They protect security for our airports, seaports, and national border, and disaster relief efforts. They also reduce duplication, improve oversight, encourage efficiency, and increase coordination of services. If there were one provision in a bill that would push you over the edge of voting for or against something, it would be the idea of getting rid of this old paperwork where I've had someone come and tell me that they had gotten a tetanus shot, I think about 3 weeks before they got out of the service. Once they got out, they went to the VA. They forgot to take the record with them, so they had no proof. They went to the VA, and the VA said, "You're going to have to get a tetanus shot." And he goes, "Wait a minute, I've already gotten one. You don't have that record?" "No, and if you don't have it with you, we don't know, because you can tell us you had one 3 months ago, but that doesn't matter. We need to do it." These bills, this one bill, gets rid of that process and says we're going to move towards a modern system, electronically transferring these records. There are so many good things in these two bills. It's just a proof text for the fact that this rule needs to be approved. I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. If we defeat the previous question, we'll offer an amendment to the rule that strikes the provision of the rule that deems the passage of the Ryan budget and will allow the House to consider the resolution calling on Speaker Boehner to proceed to the conference on the budget. It is time for the majority to follow regular House procedure by immediately requesting a conference and appointing conferees to negotiate a fiscal 2014 budget resolution conference agreement with the Senate. To discuss our proposal, I'm very pleased to yield to my good friend from Maryland, Mr. Van Hollen, 5 minutes.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend, Mr. Hastings, and I've been listening to Mr. Webster, and if I were Mr. Webster, I'd be doing exactly what he's doing, which is focusing on the underlying bills, the spending bill to support our veterans, to support military construction and homeland security. But as others have pointed out, the vote before us is not on those underlying bills. It's on the rule. And everybody needs to understand that what's at play here is a scheme to use the rules to affect not just the veterans' budget, but to affect other parts of our budget. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, I find it especially cynical that our colleagues would use the spending bills on veterans and military construction as the vehicle to pass their budget levels, which will result in dramatic cuts to the part of the budget that fund our kids' education and that fund the investments in science and research to find cures and treatments to things like cancer. Because we know the Appropriations Committee has already set out what the levels for those categories of the budget will be. And you know what they are? A $30 billion cut below the sequester level to the parts of the budget that fund our kids' education and that fund that scientific research. So yes, this is the rule for two particular bills, which they're good bills. Veterans bill is a good bill. But the rule, ladies and gentlemen, has embedded in it the Republican budget levels for the overall budget process. And that's going to hurt education for the kids of those veterans and the family members of those veterans who have diseases whose funding for research is going to be dramatically cut. 20% cut below the sequester level. That's what you're adopting in this rule, 20% cut for the category of the budget on education. Now, why are we here? We're supposed to have a budget process. The House passed a budget. I don't like the budget, but it passed a budget. The Senate passed a budget. Under the rules of the Congress, in fact, as a matter of law, the House and the Senate are supposed to have completed a conference committee by April 15th. That was quite a while ago. In fact, it's been over 70 days since the Senate passed a budget and the House passed a budget. Now, we don't have a House-Senate conference committee report. Why might that be? Well, it turns out that the Speaker of the House has refused to appoint conferees to work with the Senate to come up with a budget. Now, our Republican colleagues beat up for years on the Senate for not having a budget. I could understand that complaint, but the Senate has a budget now, and yet our Republican colleagues refuse to go to conference. You made a big deal about no budget, no pay. Guess what? We don't have a budget. We have a House budget, we have a Senate budget, but we don't have a federal budget, and yet everybody's getting paid. What happened to that? Now, why would we not want to go to conference? Look, Mr. Speaker, just today in the United States Senate, Patty Murray, the chairwoman of the Budget Committee, for the 11th time tried to get consent to go to conference to work these differences out in a transparent way, blocked by a Republican senator. Here's what Senator McCain has had to say about the whole process, because I would urge our colleagues to listen to him. This is a quote for Senator McCain. Quote, "I think it's insane for Republicans who complained for 4 years about Harry Reid not having a budget, and now we're not going to agree to conference? That is beyond comprehension for me. And I think it's beyond comprehension for the American people. Why are you sitting on the budget?" And so what are we doing here in this rule? This rule says, let's pretend. Let's make believe that the House and Senate went to conference, and let's pretend that they agreed, except let's pretend that they agreed on the House budget numbers, the numbers that would cut the part of the budget that deals with our kids' education by over 20%. Let's pretend that, because we don't want to go through the normal process. That's what this rule does. It's a total fake, and it's a fake because of the refusal to work these issues out in a transparent manner for the American people. So the previous question is a very simple statement. It just says, let's comply with the law, which says a conference committee was supposed to have met and completed action by April 15th. Let's at least start down the process of complying by the law. It says, it is the sense of the House of Representatives that the Speaker should follow regular House procedure and immediately request a conference and appoint conferees to negotiate a fiscal year 2014 budget resolution so we can have a real federal budget, not a fake budget, which is what you're calling for in this rule, under the guise of saying, let's just fund our veterans. I thank the gentleman.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, I find it especially cynical that we would use a good bill to provide spending and support to our veterans as the vehicle to impose this scheme on the Congress, which will have terrible negative effects on other parts of the budget. You know, while this Congress was away, I don't know if people saw, but down in Fort Bragg, the home of the 82nd Airborne, they just said that teachers who are going to teach the kids of our servicemen and women are going to be furloughed for 5 days this fall. For 5 days this fall. So we want to replace the sequester. Let's go to conference and get it done. I urge my colleagues who have said they want a transparent process to vote for our measure. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 5 minutes of my time to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend and colleague from Florida for yielding me the time. I hadn't anticipated coming down here today, Mr. Speaker. I came down to listen, but I hadn't anticipated coming down to speak. And I will say to my friend from Maryland, his words struck me. Because twice in his presentation he said, you know, I think it's especially cynical that we're using this process to bring forward 2 bills that, in a bipartisan way, we agree on. I would say to my friend, with a heavy heart, Mr. Speaker, that I think it's especially cynical since we both know these bills need to be passed, to describe what is happening here in any terms other than that which is exactly necessary in order to get these bills passed. Let me get this off my chest, and I'd be happy to yield to my friend. Well, I appreciate that, and if the gentleman, I'd be happy to yield when I'm done, because I have a copy of the rule here, and the gentleman was in the Rules Committee last night, and the gentleman knows this is what Section 3 provides that pending the adoption of a concurrent resolution on the budget, we're going to move forward, pending the adoption. Now, my friend knows, Mr. Speaker, how hard it is to find that agreement. And the reason my friend knows is because I voted for the Budget Control Act in August of 2011, which put my friend and 5 other members of the House, it was 6 House members, 6 Senate members, 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, it put them in a room together for August, September, October, and November with the entire federal budget over the next 100 years in front of them, allowing them to choose anything they wanted to agree on to let us move forward as a nation. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? Collectively, they agreed on not $1. Now, I don't fault my friend for that. I know my friend was working as hard as my friend could possibly work to find agreement, but finding agreement is hard. What we're talking about finding agreement with, Mr. Speaker, this comes from the Washington Post editorial page. It's entitled The Democrats' Complacent Budget Plan. It says, partisan in tone and complacent in substance, the budget scores points against Republicans and reassures the party's liberal base, but deepens these senators' commitment to an unsustainable policy agenda. This is what it is that we're trying to find agreement on. Now, my friend from Maryland knows. In fact, he may have even brought it to my attention yesterday, a letter directed to the chairman of the Rules Committee, on which I sit, Mr. Speaker, from the chairman of the Budget Committee, also on which I sit. It's signed by Chairman Paul Ryan, and it says this: over Paul Ryan's signature, I want to emphasize that this is a request for an interim measure while the Committee on the Budget continues to work towards an agreement with the Senate on a budget resolution for the coming fiscal year. And I would, with your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd ask my friend from Maryland, does he doubt the chairman's word when the chairman says this is an interim solution until we find agreement? I'd be happy to yield to my friend.
My colleague, what I know are the facts, which is just today, as I said on the floor, the chairwoman of the Senate Budget Committee for the 11th time said to Mr. Ryan, let's go to conference so we can work out these differences in a public way. And she was blocked over here just like we've been blocked over here. Let's have a...
Reclaiming my time, the gentleman knows that Chairman Ryan has no control over the inside workings of the United States Senate. And Chairman Ryan did not block what was going on in the United States Senate. United States senators were blocking that. I will ask the gentleman again.
That's why we want to have a vote on this provision.
Does the gentleman doubt the chairman's word?
Would the gentleman yield?
I would be happy to yield to the gentleman I understand that the gentleman's frustrated about process, and goodness knows as someone who supports open rules, I'm frustrated about process too. We have that in common.
Would the gentleman yield?
Notwithstanding that process, what I have here is a letter from a man that you and I both support. And support, I mean, we believe in his integrity.
Okay.
And he tells us that he is working towards a solution, and that what we're doing here today is just an interim step to get these bills that we all agree are so very important. We all agree are so very important. An interim step to get these moving down the process.
Would the gentleman yield?
I would yield to ask the gentleman, does he disagree with the commitment made by the chairman?
I'm not questioning the integrity of the chairman of the Budget Committee. Would the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield to my friend.
This is not just about process. As I indicated, you adopt this rule, and you're essentially applying a 20% cut below sequester to the part of the budget that deals with our kids' education and science and research. So this is way beyond process. The other thing, I agree.
I'd say to the gentleman, that's just not the case.
That is the case.
It's just not the case.
The gentleman should go read the Appropriations Committee 302B allocations.
I'm aware of the Appropriations Committee's 302B allocations. And what I'm aware of, Mr. Speaker, is that we have to have those allocations to begin the process. The gentleman's talking about where we're going to finish the process on October 1st. I'm trying to get us started today. The gentleman knows that we can't get started. Now, I can go back.
Why are those levels at the levels they are? Would the gentleman answer that question?
Time's expired. All members will suspend. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has agreed to S.Res. 160 relative to the memorial observances of the Honorable Frank R. Lautenberg, late a senator from the state of New Jersey.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Speaker, I yield an additional 2 minutes.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for an additional 2 minutes.
I thank my friend for yielding. I want to quote what one of my Democratic colleagues quoted last night in the Rules Committee, and that's Federalist Paper number 58, written by James Madison for the Independent Journal back on February 20th, 1788. And he said this. He said, "This power of the purse, in fact, may be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people for obtaining a redress of every grievance and for carrying into effect every just and salutary measure. Because that's the constitutional responsibility of this body, Mr. Speaker, to appropriate these dollars. This process of appropriation, this constitutional responsibility cannot begin until we have some numbers against which to budget and appropriate. And what my chairman on the Budget Committee has asked is that as an interim step and an interim step only, we adopt these numbers today on bills about which we all agree. What is cynical, Mr. Speaker, is that these are things on which we all agree, and we're using this as a position to talk about other issues about which we disagree.
With Gentleman yield, because we don't all agree on cutting
that. I would say to my friend that, as my friend knows from his time having to negotiate on the Joint Select, or the what we'll call the Super Committee, my friends at the Washington Post go on to say, in short, this document, talking about the budget passed by the Senate, gives voters no reason to believe that Democrats have a viable plan for or even a responsible public assessment of the country's long-term fiscal predicament. Now, I will say, Mr. Speaker, that gives me great concern about whether we will be able to reach agreement with the Senate. As you know, as my friend from Maryland knows, Mr. Speaker, the House budget reduces spending by trillions of dollars. The Senate budget increases spending even more. In many years, spends more than even the President requests. As my friend from Maryland knows, we keep tax revenues the same. The Senate increases taxes by almost $1 trillion.
I just want to know why you're afraid to go to conference. Why is that? That's what this is about.
All members will suspend. Gentleman from Georgia's time has expired. Gentleman from Florida is recognized. Florida, Mr. Hastings is recognized.
My colleague, I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to my very good friend from California, Ms. Barbara Lee.
Gentlelady from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the gentleman for yielding. And let me just say, first, as a member of both the Appropriations and the Budget Committee, I rise in strong opposition to this rule. The allocations provided under this rule will savage vital programs that protect the public health and safety, promote and develop our workforce, and educate the next generation of Americans. Sequester cuts are already hitting low-income families throughout our country, also in my congressional district, in my home state of California, and every single household in America, especially the millions of Americans who are struggling still to find a job. These cuts are hitting them disproportionately. Our economy cannot afford these cuts. Hungry children do not deserve these cuts. Students who depend on Pell Grants, TRIO, and Head Start do not deserve these cuts. And certainly our seniors and our veterans do not deserve these cuts. The Military Construction Veterans Bill on the floor this week assumes the sequester cuts have been replaced. Why in the world can't we do this for the other bills as well? We all know that the allocation for the rest of the subcommittees will make it nearly impossible to fund education, senior programs, infrastructure, and job creation. While all of us believe it's important to keep the government functioning, governing by continuing resolution is really no way to run the federal government, and that's exactly what course we're on unless we come to some agreement. The majority claim that they care about the middle class and the poor, yet these cuts really do begin to erode the middle class and forces more people into poverty. So it's time for Congress to reject these draconian cuts and replace the sequester with a bipartisan agreement on the budget resolution to create jobs and to lift the economy for all. Enough is enough, Mr. Speaker. We need to vote no on the rule, and we need to go back to the drawing board.
Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That last discussion was worth paying the price to come here. But I'd like to say this to bring it back to where we are, and that is we have before us a rule. This rule is going to be the gateway to an open process. That open process, when it opens up, is beautiful to behold. We have 2 bills that will be heard. Both of those bills are going to be able to be amended by any member that would like to do it. And to me, that is what I have searched for, and I think it's a great thing. We have the opportunity to come to this floor, agree or disagree, but in the end, we'll produce a product that was put together by a bipartisan group of members of 2 different committees, of the appropriation committees. And it went through the regular process. Bringing it to the floor with an open rule is the regular process, and I think that is why I'm supporting this rule, because the rule gives the gateway to us doing those bills. And I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves his time.
Mr. Speaker, I would advise
my
colleague that I have no further speakers and I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman is recognized.
Does he have more speakers? Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I guess I have to ask the question at the beginning that Mr. Van Hollen has persisted in asking, and I as well, and others, is why are you afraid to go to conference? I have no idea why you can't do that and follow the regular order. I agree with my colleague that this bipartisan measure is a very good thing that we are bringing here. But I also agree with other speakers that when we finish doing these 2 bills, and I predict, for my friend, that we will not reach a single other measure of appropriations, for the reason that if you're going to cut 22% from everything else and you're going to hold harmless the things that you and I like, then be assured we're in serious trouble as the appropriations process moves forward. We have a responsibility to implement a budget framework that supports programs which helps Americans provide for their families, to stay in their homes and remain competitive in the global economy. The Ryan budget picks winners and losers, and we're picking 2 winners today, and we're going to have 11 losers on down the road. Deem and pass did not work the last Congress. It didn't work when Democrats thought that they could try it, and it ain't going to work now. It is long past time that House Republicans work together with Democrats in conference, just as these 2 committees did, to negotiate a budget and put an end to the devastating sequester. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert in the text of the amendment in the record, along with extraneous material, immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote no and defeat the previous question. I urge a no vote on the rule, and I'm prepared to yield back the balance of my time after I ask the question one more time. Why are you afraid to go to conference?
Does the gentleman yield back his time? Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd ask unanimous consent to enter 2 letters into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The first letter is from the Budget Committee Chairman Paul Ryan. In his letter, Chairman Ryan asked the Rules Committee to follow standard practice by addressing budget enforcement pending a conference report on the budget resolution. To prevent greater uncertainty and further delays to the appropriation process, House Res 243 will include a provision, and does include a provision, that adopts the House-passed budget resolution, House Con Res 25, as an interim budget enforcement measure until an agreement may be reached with the Senate on the budget resolution for the coming fiscal year. I'd like to read an excerpt from that letter. It says this. This is from Chairman Ryan to Chairman Sessions, Rules Committee Chairman. As you know, the budget passed by the House reduces spending by $4.6 trillion and achieves balance by 2023, all without raising taxes on the American people. In contrast, the budget resolution adopted by the Senate raises taxes by over $900 billion, increases spending by $265 billion, and never, ever, ever balances. While I continue, he says, while I continue to work with my Senate counterpart to find common ground, we have not been able to reach an agreement yet. Let me finish this. And then another part of that says, until such time as we are able to reach agreement and consistent with the practice in previous years when the House and Senate have been delayed in completing action on the budget resolution, I am asking that the rule include a provision that adopts the House-passed budget resolution as an interim budget enforcement measure that will allow the appropriation process to proceed without further delay. And then the second letter is just a response from Representative Sessions, who's the chair of the Rules Committee, acknowledging that the rule would include the requested interim budget enforcement measure.
Would the gentleman yield? I just have a simple question, which is, how is it that we're going to get agreement from the House and the Senate in a conference committee if the Speaker of the House continues to refuse to go to conference? How are we going to get that agreement? The reason we don't have a conference committee budget report and you have to use this device is because there's no conference. And the reason there's no conference is because our Republican colleagues in the House refuse to appoint conferees, which is why we want to pass this amendment. Let the members vote on whether or not we go to conference.
Thank you, Mr. I reclaim my time. Mr. Speaker, I'm not involved in that process. However, I can tell you this, and I am going to close after this. I'm not going to yield back any more time, but all I can tell you is this. I was a speaker at one point in time in a different body at a different time in my career. And even if a conference committee has not been formed, there are discussions that go on. And they go on. And then eventually, there'll be a conference committee and things work out. But it doesn't necessarily mean that nothing is happening. I think